Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this afternoon's panel on the devolution of governance. The chair of this panel is Robert Stein, the Dean of the School of Social Sciences and the Lena Goldman Fox Professor of Political Science at Rice University. In addition to carrying out his duties as Dean, Bob continues to teach and do research in the areas of federalism and intergovernmental relations, state and local government, urban politics, and public policy. Both his teaching and research concern federal spending. He is also a well-known political analyst here in Houston and in Texas on KHOU-TV Houston. He has served on the editorial boards of 4 major journals and is author of dozens of journal articles on federal spending. He is also the author of 3 books on the topic, his most recent published in 1995 titled Perpetuating the Pork Barrel, Policy Subsystems and American Democracy. He is indeed one of my closest collaborators at the Baker Institute and the School of Social Sciences. It's my honor to present Dr. Bob Stein.
Thank you, Ed. Before I begin, I want to thank Ed and all of his staff for putting on what has so far been, and I expect to be a very excellent and well-organized and extremely well-attended conference for those of us who are academics. This audience size is both gratifying and unusual. Today's panel is on a topic that is probably not on the tips of everybody's tongue, like crime or tax reform. Topics of that sort tend to generate a great deal of press and national interest. Devolution is a topic that is not what normally comes across even my students' lips. And today we are talking about what I think is, and some of the speakers in the morning session I think alluded to, a rather important topic, and that is, of course, the apparent shift in federal responsibilities back to the state and local governments. First among those, of course, is the recent block grant for welfare, which states now are beginning to just grapple with. Our panel today is attempting to look at that from a number of perspectives. We have put together really 2 panels in one. The first session will be 4 papers by distinguished academics who've written on this topic and are well known in the academic community and some even more widely. The second half will be discussants. I'll introduce them later on. They are men who have actually dealt with this policy question as governor, mayor, and former lieutenant governor of their respective states. The 4 panelists on the stage with me today are, in order from my far right, Peter Eisinger, who is a Glenn B. Cologne and Orr Hawkins Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Wisconsin and the La Follette Institute for Public Policy, and their past director. Peter is known for his work in urban politics, more recently economic development. His paper is going to be looking at the topic of cities in the new federal order. Next to him is a former Rice professor, actually, Ken Bickers, who was at Rice and unfortunately left for Indiana University. He is a good friend of mine and a collaborator on Perpetuating the Pork Barrel. 3 P's in a row. Ken's work picks up on work we've done together, but is a project to look at the politics of this new revolution in the shift of federal responsibilities, particularly how it will affect nonprofits and states and how they'll deal with the issues of assigning responsibilities. Next to Ken is Paul Peterson, who is the director, I should say, first for the Center for American Political Studies at Harvard University and the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government at Harvard University. Paul is one of the leading proponents of a theoretical perspective on urban politics that has pretty much defined the field of urban politics in state and local governments in his book, City Limits. His more recent work on the price of federalism is addressed this whole question of devolution, and Paul will be looking at this issue of whether or not the states will in fact be, I think the phrase is, rushing to the bottom in order to deal with the new welfare policy. Our last speaker, actually our second last speaker, but sitting next to me is Andy Rashofsky. Andy is also from the University of Wisconsin. He's a professor of public affairs and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He's also a fellow at the La Follette Center. I will not belabor anymore, I'm going to ask each of the presenters to limit themselves to about 20 minutes. Each have prepared papers. For those of you who would like, there is a paper room off the foyer. You can obtain copies of the papers. Again, the plan is for each presenter to present their paper. We'll take a very brief intermission to have our discussants come up on stage. We'll proceed with their comments on the papers. After the panelists, both the discussants and paper presenters, have finished, we'll be taking written questions from the audience. Just raise your hand. Ushers will come down the aisles and give you cards and collect them. We're a little tight today, but I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. With that, I will ask Peter to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you for including me in this rather large contingent of Wisconsin folks that have been imported down here. Personally, it's nice for me to come down to thaw out. Not many people in national politics are talking about the role and future of cities these days. There are a few exceptions. The current Secretary of HUD, Henry Cisneros, one of your native sons, and the former Secretary of HUD and erstwhile vice presidential candidate, Jack Kemp, is also talking about cities. But for the most part, urban affairs are not matters of polite conversation in Washington these days. This is curious, because cities have a deep stake, it seems to me, in the process and outcomes of the ongoing devolutionary trend that we see at work in the federal system, what I call the new federal order. Now, the details of this rearrangement of federal responsibilities have not entirely been worked out, and in fact may never be. We've been arguing over them for about 200 years, so this is a continual work in progress. But I think that this is a good moment to speculate on the implication for cities of the ongoing federal devolutionary transformation. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this particular moment, because it's the case that the devolutionary trends we see today have been in process for approximately the last 25 years. But a couple of developments now catch our attention. One, of course, is the signing of the welfare bill this summer, the welfare reform, which is going to produce a major reallocation of responsibilities in the federal system, a major devolution. A second development of note at this moment that causes us to take stock is President Clinton's pronouncement that the era of big government is over. Now, this is not particularly news, but what's noteworthy about that is that it's a Democrat who has really, in my view, read the last rites of the New Deal, Great Society federal model. It is really dead. To explore the implications of this new devolved federal order for cities, I suggest that we look at three different areas. First, the contraction of federal aid to cities, which has been going on for a while. Second, the direct implications of formal devolution for urban government. And third, the indirect consequences, both fiscal and political, of this new federal order. And let me begin with fiscal contraction. This is a well-known story. Federal aid to state and local governments started to decline in 1978 at the midpoint of the Carter administration, and then took a quite sharp dip in the first years of the Reagan administration. Then the trajectory bottomed out somewhere in the 1980s and began toward the late 80s to go back up again. And today, federal aid to state and local governments has reachieved and indeed surpassed the peak of 1978. But what's different today is that the bulk of the money today goes for Medicaid and for welfare. In other words, aid to individuals pass through the state and not to local governments. Just to give you another perspective on this federal contraction, in 1977, municipal governments depended on Washington for about 15% of their revenues. By 1992, urban governments were depending on Washington for only 3% of their revenues. In these years, a number of key urban programs were either eliminated entirely or cut. General revenue sharing, the Urban Development Action Grants, both were eliminated. The EDA programs, the Economic Development Administration programs, were cut, some were eliminated. The mainstay of urban aid, the Community Development Block Grant, CDBGs, you have to be able to say that very fast if you're an urbanist. CDBGs were cut. Mass transit aid was cut, and a number of others. To leave the story here would not be entirely fair, however. I do want to point out that aid to the cities from Washington in the mid-1990s seems to have stabilized somewhat. As far as I can tell, the big cuts are over, though the level of aid to cities, I remind you, is quite low. But an analysis by the U.S. Conference of Mayors of federal funding for municipal programs shows that about 30% of them actually increased between 1995 and 96 in the fiscal years. 20%, I believe, remained stable, and the other half were indeed cut. But the pattern seems to be one of stabilization now rather than the sharp cuts that we experienced during the 1980s. The bottom line here, nevertheless, is that cities in this new devolved federal order are now more fiscally independent than they have been at any time in the last 20 years. Let me turn to formal devolution. In the years of President Reagan, formal devolution passed authority back from Washington to the states. In fact, many of the categorical grants that were consolidated to create the famous cluster of block grants early in the Reagan administration had originally gone to cities. The block grants then shifted these funds from the cities as categorical grants to the states as block grants. So devolution in the Reagan years had very little formal effect on the cities. No formal powers were devolved to the cities. Today, we look to the new welfare bill as the exemplar of devolution, and it too has devolved authority and responsibility to the states, not to the cities. Nevertheless, the devolutionary trends that we see in process have not entirely bypassed the cities altogether, and I can give you a couple of examples. One is something called the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. I can't imagine a more cumbersome or obscure name for a piece of legislation. I wonder how many ordinary Americans could tell you what an intermodal transportation system was. But believe me, it devolves power to both states and cities, and that's important. That's from 1991. And there are several other things. I believe that the Empowerment Zone program passed in 1993 in the first Clinton budget also devolves a certain amount of power to local governments. And I should point out that devolution is on the national agenda. Devolution to the cities is on the national agenda in a variety of other areas, particularly in HUD, where Secretary Cisneros has proposed several different block grant consolidations that would pass money and great flexibility back to the cities. As of yet, these have not, however, passed. So here, the bottom line is that cities, to me, appear to be on the brink of taking part in the devolution revolution, but so far are not yet full participants. As devolution proceeds, cities will be and have been subject to a variety of indirect effects. Let me talk about indirect fiscal effects and indirect political effects. Beginning with the fiscal effects. Much of this, I must say, is speculative. We haven't seen it at work yet, but we are trying to anticipate, particularly the consequences of the new welfare reform. Some scholars predict that the states will also feel the pinch of devolution, that Washington will pass back authority without the dollars to the states, and the states in turn will poach on local revenues. As far as I know, this hasn't happened much yet, but it's something that local officials are wary about. Speculation about the local indirect fiscal impacts of the new welfare bill are also in the air. Some suggest that entitlement cuts and time limits will ultimately diminish both the local consumer economy. Mom and pop grocery stores, for example, will no longer have the steady trade that they enjoyed from welfare customers bringing in their money to buy groceries. And it will also diminish, in the view of many economists, the local tax base, the city tax base, by reducing demand for rental housing, and for those cities that have sales taxes by diminishing the consumer economy and therefore the generation of sales taxes. Others suggest that the work and education requirements and job training requirements in the new welfare law will ultimately impose costs on local governments. They will undoubtedly create demands for work in the public sector, for more classroom space, and for job training programs. And it is, I am sure, the case that local government will bear some of the costs of these new work and training requirements. Indeed, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the shortfall in support of these work and education requirements is going to reach about $12 billion over the next half decade. And I'm sure the local governments will have, along with the states, of course, will have to pick up some of these costs. So much for the indirect fiscal effects. I think there are also going to be some indirect, and already have been, some indirect political effects. The most important impact on the cities of the shifting balance in the federal system has been to change what I call the moral tenor of local politics. The scarcity of federal aid, indeed of all resources in the cities, has put a premium on public management skills. More than ever, cities must make do with what they themselves can raise. Their ingenuity is very much on display in managing and husbanding their resources. So compelling, I think, are the incentives to manage resources well that good public administration has displaced promotion of the urban social agenda that dominated local politics in the 1960s and the 1970s, and even into the early 1980s. The new mayors speak the language of modern public management, and they run their cities accordingly. They believe in reinvention, in innovation, in privatization, in competition, in strategic planning, in benchmarking, in productivity improvements. They favor economic development and low taxes, partnership with the business community, and they believe in keeping the potholes filled and the streetlights on. Social issues and economic issues, the income gap, teenage pregnancy, unemployment, poverty, racial issues, affirmative action, these all may be on mayoral agendas, or they may not, and they often are not. But if they are, many of the new mayors insist that the only way to address these is by better public management. Now, the new mayors range across the ideological and party and racial spectrum, and they include my colleague from Wisconsin, John Norquist, who's an exemplar, and a much admired one, and deservedly, John. Ed Rendell of Philadelphia, Steve Goldsmith, Dennis Archer, Michael White, Bill Campbell. But these new mayors stand in contrast to the mayors of the 1960s and 70s, the prototype liberal mayors, if you want, like John Lindsay and Jerome Kavanaugh and Carl Stokes and Richard Lee. Today, the mayors seek guidance from the market, not the moral compass of the liberal reform agenda. Now, in some ways, the emergence of public management in place of social reform, if you want, might be seen as a narrowing of political vision. I prefer to see it in a somewhat more generous light, and I would suggest that it can be interpreted as a realistic response to a world of tighter resource constraints. And certainly, good public management is welcomed by hard-pressed taxpayers. A recent article in a magazine called The New Democrat, contrasting the old guard black mayors with the new generation of black mayors, makes a set of similar observations. And I quote here, they, the Archers and the Campbells and the Mike Whites and Norm Rices, they've moved beyond rallies and protest marches, are replacing talk with action and ushering in an era of competent professional stewardship in cities long racked by poverty and crime. And I say this is good news, certainly. But I wonder if there are some costs. I wonder, finally, who is attending the social justice agenda in the cities these days. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ken Bickers.
Well, it's nice to be back here in Houston and at Rice. I have the distinct impression that the old aphorism about having to come more than 150 miles to be an expert holds in my case. It also reminds me of the old line that if all the experts in America were lined up head to foot, that would probably be a good thing. But let me talk for a few minutes about how I come to this issue of looking at the politics of devolution. I, as was mentioned earlier, have been working for a number of years in a collaborative project and some others with Bob Stein on federal spending and the politics of the federal grant system. But I've been asked in the last year to work with the State Association of United Ways in Indiana, specifically to look at the impact of welfare reform on nonprofits. The United Ways in Indiana are worried. They are also excited about welfare reform and what it means for the agencies and operations of the various agencies that the United Way funds. But devolution, I think, is interesting in many respects, and to anticipate my remarks at the end, they come to a head in looking at nonprofits and local governments as we think about what the impact of welfare reform might be. But let me start by talking a little bit about what devolution means, and I'll talk about it in four respects. The first is that devolution at a very basic, simple level is an experiment in policy implementation. It's a spur to innovation. It means that we're going to try things differently in the past. It's also a shift in the locus of power. This is part of what Peter has talked about, the new federal order. I think more fundamentally, the third way to look at it is that it's the way in practice Americans currently are rewriting their Constitution, the small c Constitution. I don't mean that dusty document that you have on your bedstand next to your bed at night that you look at after looking through your Bible every evening. I'm not talking about that formal written Constitution. I'm talking about the way we constitute government, the way we constitute the authority structures, the relationships of citizens to their governments and governments to one another in the United States. And that's what we're about currently. That's what devolution means, and it's one of the reasons I think it's exciting to look at. It also means it's very important to think through the political processes and the kinds of implications of devolution for what this means in terms of pressures on government, demands, how well it's going to work, and so forth. There's a fourth way that I think that devolution is important, particularly in the case of welfare reform. I think it's a recognition that the federal government doesn't know what to do. There's an intellectual vacuum at the level of the federal government about how to solve the poverty problem. We've been at this for a very long time. For 30 years, we've tried to solve the poverty problem, and we don't have it solved, and all of the statistics and measures indicate that the problem not only is not solved, it's worse. And what we're about is a practical experiment in trying to find a better solution, and the way we're doing that is by delegating responsibility to the states and through the states to local governments to try and find a solution. Hopefully, with enough efforts out there, someone will come up with an idea for trying to solve the poverty problem. And that means that we really need to keep an eye on this. We need to watch what's going on in the various states and in the hundreds of communities out there as the experiments, the innovations are underway to try to solve the poverty problem. Let me give a brief overview of devolution. As Peter suggested, this isn't new. We have been discussing devolution now almost as long as we've had the Great Society. For the last 20 to 25 years, there have been discussions of devolution. We're moving into it in a big way currently. The Clinton administration, along with the Republican Congress, are committed at various levels, I think, toward a devolutionary agenda and so we should go back and look at the history of it. There have been two major periods of devolutionary reform over the last 25 years, coinciding with the Nixon administration and the Reagan administrations. And I would argue that the kinds of responses, efforts at devolution, have in some cases looked the same, but have been undertaken for different reasons. And sorting out these reasons is worthwhile to note. The Nixon administration undertook to use block grants and general revenue sharing with the avowed intention of trying to build in flexibility in the federal system. That no federal policy could take account of all of the different kinds of exigencies that are out there in society, the differences from one community to another, and that block grants would allow for both greater flexibility and a rationalization of federal power. The federal government would increase spending in the areas where block grants would be created, but there would be greater flexibility for communities and states through the block grants. That is, money would be handed to the states or to the cities, and they would be able to do things with those monies to solve particular kinds of policy problems. The Nixon administration attempted to create block grants in the areas of education, transportation, public works, including wastewater treatment and so forth. It by and large failed to get many of the block grant programs created, but it made a strong effort to try and get block grants. Its major success was the creation of general revenue sharing, the program that provided basically a check each quarter to all the general purpose governments in the United States without asking. The checks would arrive in the mail. The Reagan administration also used block grants. And some of these same motives were present with the Reagan administration: flexibility, rationalization. But I think it's arguably the case that the Reagan administration undertook block grants in part as a political strategy to try and find a way to reduce the dependence of states and local governments on the federal government and permit a kind of pathway, a provisional step for reducing federal spending. The Reagan administration tried successively to eliminate general revenue sharing, and ultimately, of course, was successful in that. General revenue sharing was killed. And in most of the block grant areas, the block grants that were created, spending on those block grants was reduced from one year to the next and in real dollar terms. The two justifications then, the Nixon administration justification for block grants was flexibility and rationalization. The Reagan administration, I think it was as much as anything a kind of provisional step for reducing reliance on the federal government. All along, there was a third theme percolating, and I think it's this third theme which is as interesting today as either of the other two. And that third theme is that block grants, as a method for trying to create devolution, federal authority, allow for experimentation. That what we should see is an old-fashioned notion in American politics. And that old-fashioned notion is the states as laboratories of democracy. That is to say that what we would see is policy efforts that are akin to hypotheses in action, that we would see experiments taking place. And I think that's, as much as anything, the exciting justification, even if there are these others out there too, for the welfare reform that's underway. That what we'll see is these hypotheses in action. We'll see the states going back to being the laboratories of democracy, and we certainly see that. Wisconsin, Michigan, with Governor Engler here today, and other states that have experimented with trying to find new solutions to these old programs. So what are the politics? What happens when we go to block grants? What's the implication for what we're likely to see over the next 5, 10, 15 years as we use block grants and devolve other responsibilities to the states besides just welfare? Well, for that we can go back and look at some of the block grants from the 1980s and general revenue sharing that was created in the 1970s. There's an interesting thing that happens with block grants. One of the things that happens with block grants is that nothing stays the same. Politics emerges around the block grants. One of the things that block grants do is that they work in terms of inducing creativity at the local level, bringing out new actors, nonprofit organizations, local governments, vying for those dollars. That is, people compete for those funds. They want those monies, they seek those monies, and they compete for these monies on a year-in, year-out basis. One of the things that happens with that is that that creates uncertainty about future financing. There's nothing worse than getting a bunch of money this year and having to worry about what happens next year. You hire people, you buy resources, cars, physical plant, that sort of thing. If you have an organization, stability and certainty become very important. And one of the things that the block grants did during the 1980s is to create a kind of craving for certainty and stability on the part of the recipients of the block grant funds, the nonprofits, the local governments, and so forth. Over time, what happened is that coalitions began to form around these block grants among the nonprofit providers, local governments, and those coalitions began to argue for certainty in financing, to have the kind of earmarking that existed under the categorical programs that were all lumped together to create the block grant. And what we saw during the 1980s around most of the block grant programs was a very striking pattern. This is a period when federal spending is actually declining. Federal programs are under enormous pressure to be cut. Gramm-Rudman is out there like this giant axe hanging over federal spending. And what happened around the block grants? Well, block grant spending didn't tend to go up in most of the block grant areas, but something else did. New programs began to emerge around each of the block grants. It's a very striking development. Community Service Block Grant went from one block grant, fairly modest spending, in 1982, so that by the end of the decade, it has about 7 or 8 programs that surround that core block grant, recategorizing spending, providing certainty to the nonprofits and local governments and so forth, that allow them a direct channel back into the federal purse for certainty in spending. The same thing happened in Social Services Block Grant. Social Services Block Grant starts off as one of 2 programs in the agency administering the Social Service Block Grant. By the end of the decade, there are 8 programs surrounding that block grant. Overall spending is up in real dollar terms. I'm not talking just nominal dollars. I'm talking real dollars. Spending is going up around these things. And what happens with these block grants is that while there may be initially devolution, real responsibility shifting to the local governments and the nonprofits that are out there seeking these funds, coalitions begin to form around them. Well, what does that mean for welfare reform? Let me turn to that as the last issue. When we think about welfare reform, we're talking about a devolution to the states and from the states to local governments and local governments to nonprofits. Nonprofits are going to be involved in 2 ways. The first is that they're going to end up being contracted to provide basic services. That is, they'll become an arm of the local governments providing core services. They do that already. They'll do that even more under the new law. There's more enabling legislation for that. It's one of the ways that the states are likely to experiment and local governments are likely to experiment with a variety of different things. Nonprofits are likely to play a very important role simply as a contractor. Some people arguing about what that means for nonprofits, just incidentally, point to the loss of innovation and flexibility for the nonprofits when they get locked into these contracts. But I want to focus on another issue. And that is what happens as the welfare problem leads to, the welfare law begins to work its way through and clients begin to use up their eligibility. The federal government allows 5 years of eligibility. Some states allow as little as 2 years. In my state of Indiana, because there was a waivered program for welfare that started last year, there will be clients using up their eligibility beginning early this next year. In the next 3 months, we'll start seeing people using up their eligibility in the state of Indiana for welfare. The nonprofits and local governments are going to end up being not just the contractors of government services. They're going to end up being the line of last resort for these people. The nonprofits are going to be the place where these people can go because under the new welfare law, federal monies can't be used on people who've used up their eligibility. Other monies can be. Now, there are 2 possibilities. One possibility, and let's hope that this is the main possibility, is that people will in fact get jobs and they will begin to move themselves out of poverty. That's the hope and that's the goal, and we should all pray that the welfare law actually provides the kinds of incentives to solve these problems and helps move significant portions of the population out of poverty and into the workforce. If the economy is growing, abundant jobs and so forth, that possibility is likely to exist and be a dominant possibility. The other possibility is that people will not all work their way out of poverty that way, but they will use up their eligibility. And as they do that, they're going to start seeking emergency funding from nonprofits. As that happens, the nonprofits are likely to start trying to form these same kinds of coalitions that they did in the 1980s, coalitions with the local governments. Local governments and nonprofits are going to be in a dance with one another, and it may not be possible to tell who's leading the dance, whether the local governments are forming the coalitions with the nonprofits or the nonprofits with the local governments. But what they will end up doing, I think, the politics of the 90s and the next century, next millennium, it looks like the 1980s, we will see pressures for spending at the state level and the federal level to make up for these deficiencies, to provide emergency funds that go beyond the 2-year or 5-year eligibility, that provide emergency assistance for people on welfare and so forth. And what we're likely to see is pressures for new programs. One of the interesting things that this means, I think, and this has implications for the paper that Paul Peterson will be presenting a little while from now, is that the nonprofits and the local governments, as they put pressures on the states and the federal government to respond to these emergency requests, these people who have not found their way out of poverty, may provide a countervailing force that works against the race to the bottom as the states try to compete not to be the place where welfare recipients go. That is, there's pressures from the below, not from the welfare recipients directly, but from the nonprofits and local governments working together to form coalitions to put pressure on the states and the federal government to provide emergency funding. What that means as a practical matter is that we may not see the kind of race to the bottom as the states reduce their welfare spending and the federal government moves out of this process altogether. What we may see is a much more complicated picture, where the federal government stays involved with new kinds of programs, with new initiatives, and the states have to work with their local governments and their nonprofits, not because they want to, but because they are forced to. The coalitions emerging at the local levels to put pressure on them to try and find some emergency assistance and response to these kinds of pressures as we go along. What that means is that devolution won't be a one-way street. The reconstituting of governance in this country will be a two-way street. It'll be both down and it will be up. And it's likely to be a kind of continuing struggle or handshake as we move through this process of trying to rethink how we're going to solve policy problems and how government at all of its various levels responds to those problems.
Thank you, Ken. Our next speaker is Andrew Rashofsky.
Thank you, Bob. I'm delighted to be here.
Is your mic on? Hold it.
Oh, it's on. It's on.
It's on. Okay.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Events over the last couple years have signaled an important change in the relationships between the federal government and state and local governments. Collectively, these events are known as devolution. I think the core change has been a desire on the part of Congress to reduce the authority of the federal government in a wide array of arenas, and conversely, to increase the responsibilities of state and local governments, and to give state and local governments a freedom from federal regulations. Two major events occurred, and I want to focus on those today. First was the passage of the welfare bill by Congress a few months ago, and the signing into law of that bill by President Clinton. The most significant element of this legislation is that individuals are no longer entitled to cash assistance. irrespective of the hardships they face or their efforts to find gainful employment. Responsibilities for economic well-being of the needy is shifted to state governments. The welfare reform legislation also created block grants, as we've heard, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. The second event that occurred and that defines devolution, or our move towards devolution, is an agreement in principle between the Congress on one hand and the President to balance the budget by the year 2002. This afternoon, I'd like to address the question of how state and local governments will respond to devolution. States are being given a wide range of new responsibilities. In most cases, they'll have to meet these responsibilities with reduced financial assistance from the federal government. Will state governments be able to meet this challenge? Now, a number of governors of states in the United States have argued that once they are freed from federal regulations and mandates, they will not only be able to better meet the demands of their citizens, but be able to do so with fewer resources. I want to suggest this afternoon that over the next 5 or 10 years, devolution is likely to exacerbate state and local fiscal problems. And holes are likely to appear in the social safety net, and more of the costs of providing assistance to the state's most needy citizens will be shifted to local governments or to nonprofits. Let me start with welfare reform. The welfare system that was in place until about a month ago, as everyone I suspect knows, was called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. Under the provisions of the AFDC program, states were free to determine the amount of cash assistance they would pay families. The criteria for determining eligibility, however, rested with Congress. AFDC was financed jointly by the federal government and state governments through what are called open-ended matching grants. The federal government grant paid a specified share of every dollar a state spent on the welfare system, with the federal share varying by states and the federal share being higher in low-income states. And the average federal share was about 60%. The new legislation established a system of what are called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF grants. These are block grants which will remain largely unchanged and will be largely invariant to the number of people in need of assistance. The new legislation allows states complete authority to determine who will receive cash assistance and under what conditions. Not complete authority, but almost complete authority. One of the things that the legislation requires that in order for a state to receive the block grant, states must require that families seek employment and go to work. It also requires that unmarried teenage parents live with an adult and participate in education training programs. And it sets a 5-year limit, lifetime limit, on the receipt of public assistance. Question is, how will states respond to this new fiscal environment? Will they cut their own spending on welfare as a result of the switch to block grants? Economic theory provides, and I should say I'm an economist, so I won't put equations up if there's no board, but there's a fundamental principle, I think, that helps us understand how states may respond. Congress initially adopted matching grants as a means of encouraging states to increase their generosity, the generosity of their welfare programs. Matching grants for AFDC lower what's called the tax price of welfare spending. Now, the term tax price refers to the cost to state taxpayers of increasing spending by an extra dollar. So if the state wants to spend more money on education, it costs, let's say, $1 more on education, it costs state taxpayers an extra dollar. But the same was not true for welfare. Because of the matching grant, if a state wanted to spend $1 more on welfare, on public assistance, and it was an average state, it would cost the state taxpayers, the tax price was only 40 cents. The federal government would contribute 60 cents. As block grants do not depend on the level of state spending, the immediate impact of switching from matching grants to block grants is that the tax price for welfare goes from, in the average state, 40 cents to $1. A basic tenet of economics is that when prices go up, demand goes down. Research on matching grants indicates that this proposition applies to government behavior as well. Thus, we would expect that as we move from block grants to block grants, states will reduce their spending on cash assistance. Now, what does the empirical evidence show? And there have been, over the years, a large number of econometric statistical studies of state welfare behavior, spending levels. And most of these studies seem to suggest that the use of block grants for filing welfare will lead to a decline in benefit levels. The magnitude and the statistical significance of the average state government response to change in matching rate, however, varies substantially. Some studies find that there would be large reductions in spending, and some studies find relatively minor reductions in spending. So there's an ambiguity in the econometric evidence. Is there any other evidence out there? One of the things we can look at is the experience with SSIs, Supplementary Security Income. It's a program that in 1974, it had a different name, but it changed from a matching, equivalent of a matching program to a block grant. And the federal government then set the block grant amount, the SSI payment, at approximately the level of benefits in the median state. What happened was that low benefit states stopped state spending. High benefit states maintained their state spending, but they haven't changed it since 1974. So the value of state spending has been substantially reduced, and there's been a gradual substitution of federal to state funding. Substitution of state to federal funding. The SSI program provides assistance to three groups of people: blind, disabled, and low-income elderly. These people have usually been called the deserving poor. The fact that states have reduced funding for cash assistance for this group suggests that when given the opportunity, state expenditures target to what many people think is a much less sympathetic group, welfare mothers, spending will be dramatically reduced. The bottom line, after looking at all the evidence, my bottom line, is that my best guess is that after a few years, states will have reduced their spending on welfare by about 30%. Remember that welfare spending was available to states at a big discount because of the federal contributions, and that's not going to be true anymore. One thing that is certain, I think, is that states are going to respond in very different ways, and what some states do may affect what other states do, and that's really the topic of Paul Peterson's talk, so I won't say any more about that now. I think the critical question is not really how states spend the dollar amounts, but whether states will manage to get people off welfare and into jobs. That was the basic reason for welfare reforms. States appear to underestimate the difficulty of placing individuals into jobs. As welfare caseloads decline, and they have declined in many states, in most states in the last few years, but as they decline, it becomes increasingly difficult to find jobs for those who remain on the rolls. Many individuals remaining on the rolls have a set of personal characteristics and a history that makes them unattractive to potential employers. They lack work experience, may have limited intelligence, poor training, they may have mental or physical health problems, and so forth. Evidence from a large body of research on the effectiveness of programs designed to increase employment among welfare recipients suggests that it is extremely difficult to move a large number of people from welfare to work, especially when the funds are limited. And think what has to happen as we're moving to a new system of welfare. States will have to convert their welfare offices from organizations whose primary task was to hand out cash assistance to organizations designed to place low-income people and low-income families in jobs. This is going to involve a substantial retraining of welfare caseworkers as job counselors and job facilitators. It's going to require the establishment of complex computer systems capable of tracking jobs openings, training opportunities, work and welfare histories, immigration status, and so forth. Welfare offices will also have to see that adequate child care is available to enable single mothers to accept full-time employment. To meet these new responsibilities will require a substantial infusion of new resources. Although the block grants will provide extra resources in the first few years, analysis by the Congressional Budget Office suggests that in most states, available funds will be inadequate to meet the cost of establishing and operating new welfare systems. There is also evidence that even when the economy is strong, there may be an insufficient number of jobs to employ all those requiring work under terms of the new legislation. The shortage of available jobs is likely to be a particularly serious problem in our central cities. Not only do a substantial portion of those currently receiving welfare reside in central cities, but cities have been, at the same time, steadily losing the low-skilled jobs for which welfare clients can most easily qualify. Work activities that satisfy the work requirements of the new legislation include community service programs and, in some cases, subsidized public employees. Given the spatial concentration in cities of welfare recipients, the creation and the subsidization of an adequate number of these community jobs or public jobs is going to be extremely difficult, and it will undoubtedly raise the ire of municipal employee unions. I think, in my mind, the most serious problem with the welfare reform legislation with block grants is what is going to happen when the next recession occurs. In a recession, costs of providing financial assistance rise. Unemployment rate rises, more people will need public assistance. What happens to block grants? Block grants, for the most part, remain unchanged. At the same time, the state's fiscal ability to respond to these greater increases in demand, the higher costs, is diminished because during a recession, tax revenues generally go down. During the recession, states will thus face two unpleasant choices. They can raise taxes in order to finance the extra costs of providing assistance to those unable to find jobs during recession, or they can refuse to provide service to the needy, shifting, where possible, the costs to the private sector, to the nonprofit sector, and to local governments. Raising taxes runs the risk of exacerbating a recession, while cutting services may create hardships and sufferings for those individuals least able to help themselves. I think children will be particularly at risk. Now, I should mention that there is in the legislation a $2 billion contingency fund that states may draw upon during periods of recession. It provides a matching fund for states to draw on. The fund, however, is almost certainly inadequate to fully replace the automatic increase in federal funds that would have occurred under an open-ended matching grant. And in addition, eligible, and I won't go into the details, but a number of states that will need more funds during a recession will not be eligible for the contingency fund. Let me argue that the elimination of the entitlement status for welfare and the conversion to block grants will generate substantial pressure on states to reduce expenditure of their own funds on welfare. It appears highly unlikely that states will be able to achieve the dual goals of placing most current recipients of public assistance in permanent jobs while simultaneously reducing welfare spending. Now, let me turn for a few minutes to balancing the budget. Congress passed a budget resolution in 1995 that spelled out in a lot of detail how they would balance the budget, although President Clinton vetoed that resolution. He has subsequently agreed to the major elements of the Republican plan, namely that the budget will be balanced in now 6 years by the year 2002, and that there will be no major cuts or no cuts in defense spending, that there will be no cuts in Social Security benefits, and in the campaign, where Medicare became a big issue, I think it's safe to say that both the Republicans and the Democrats are now going to, for the most part, put Medicare off the table. The result, and in addition, rather than raising taxes to close the deficit, both Democrats and Republicans have said they're going to reduce taxes. The consequence of this, what one can call a bipartisan agreement, is that the entire cost of balancing the budget is going to have to come from spending cuts. And if you got a table when you came in, Figure 1 shows briefly how, in fiscal year 1996, the federal government spends its money. And what one can see is that 2/3 of federal spending is so-called off the table. So all the spending cuts will have to come from state and local grants and all other spending, about 1/3 of the budget. And about more than 40% of federal spending that is on the table, subject to cuts, is in the form of grants from the federal government to state and local governments. It is then, I think, inevitable that the process of balancing the budget, given the agreement made by the President and Congress, is that there will have to be large cuts in federal spending. It's likely that those cuts, by the year 2002, those grants to state and local governments will have to be about 30% lower than they would be under current law. Now, the question that I would like to ask is, how well are states positioned to deal with these federal budget cuts? The answer obviously depends on the importance of federal grants in states' fiscal economy and on specific fiscal conditions in each state. One has to answer this question comprehensively, look at all 50 states. In my paper, I looked briefly at Wisconsin and Illinois and Washington and California. Here, let me just say very briefly a few words about the situation in Wisconsin and California. Wisconsin is blessed with a very strong economy. At first glance, it appears that if any state is in a good position to deal with federal budget cuts, it should be Wisconsin. However, the fiscal situation in Wisconsin is overshadowed by two recent policy decisions in Wisconsin. One, a major effort to provide property tax relief, and secondly, an effort that's been going on for a number of years to get tough on crime, to, as we heard this morning, to incarcerate more prisoners and to see that they stay in prison for longer terms. The consequences for the state of property tax relief and the way that Wisconsin is doing it is the state is providing 2/3 of all money for K-12 education, for public education. That's going to cost $1.2 billion in extra funding this year, and schools will have the first call on state funds in the years to come. What I've done is tried to estimate, okay, how much is it going to cost the state to meet these commitments and to maintain spending on the programs they're now providing from now through 2005, and compare that number, that current service budget, with the available revenue. And the difference is what's called a structural deficit. And if you'll take a look at, on the other side, I guess, Figure 2, you'll see two lines which represent the structural deficits, estimated structural deficits through 2005 in the state of Wisconsin. The bottom line assumes that there are no cuts in federal grants. And you can see that even with no federal cuts, Wisconsin will have significant fiscal problems. By 2005, the structural deficit will be about 11% of general fund revenue. Now, if you add to that make a likely estimate of how much federal grants are going to be cut, we're going to see a ballooning, and that's the top line, of the structural deficits facing Wisconsin. By 2002, the year the federal budget should be balanced, in Wisconsin, the structural deficit will be close to 25% of general fund revenues. Those are big structural deficits that will require large tax increases or big cuts in spending in order to eliminate them. A quick word about California. California's economy is recovering from the worst recession since the 1930s. Nevertheless, California's fiscal health appears particularly vulnerable to cuts in federal funds. Two factors dominate California's fiscal future. First, self-imposed, in some sense, constraints on both taxing and spending, and self-imposed by voter initiatives. And secondly, a rapid growth in population, including the growth of a large immigrant population. One of the things that a series of propositions did in California is requires minimum spending on K to 14 education. The implication of that is that that education spending will grow by 56% between this year and 2002. Proposition 184 in California is the now famous or infamous 3 strikes and you're out provision. Again, that will, as we saw this morning, will have big implications for the costs of corrections in California. On top of that, California is facing a very rapid increase in population, including school-age population. Public school enrollment is projected to grow at 30% during the next 10 years. That means that the costs of education, government spending, will grow rapidly. Even without any federal budget cuts, California would be faced with severe fiscal problems. If you place on top of that projected federal cuts and grants that are necessary to balance the federal budget, California will face very severe fiscal situations. In summary, okay, okay. Let me summarize by saying that my projection is that devolution, as measured by welfare reform and balanced budgeting, will have significant impacts for state finance. Now, what does one conclude from that? I don't conclude that we should throw out welfare reform, throw out balancing the budget. I think, however, that it is possible to structure welfare reform in such a way where states are giving a great deal of flexibility in determining who gets welfare and under what conditions, but maintaining a federal safety net for those who satisfy all the conditions but still can't find employment. And the only effective way to do that in an economy that inevitably will have boom periods and recessions is through matching grants. And secondly, although the federal deficit has been coming down, we shouldn't be overjoyed because into the next century, the problem of entitlement reform is going to be very serious. We cannot shy away from the problem of balancing the deficit. But the real problem, again, is facing Social Security and Medicare reform, not taking them off the table. If we put them on the table, consider the broad range of responsibilities faced by government, I think it is possible to balance the federal budget in the long run without balancing it on the back of state and local governments.
Thank you, Andy. Paul Peterson.
Well, this is the time of the day when a conference like this tends to turn into a Rembrandt painting. Everybody's digesting their food and so on. So let me begin by saying that I think we have the finest federal system in the world. And one should look at devolution in the context that this federal system that we have in the United States is unique. And it's very powerful, it's very dynamic, and it does tremendous things for the economic well-being of all Americans, and therefore we want to preserve it. And what's unique about it is that state and local governments are pretty much, not all together, but pretty much tubs that sit on their own bottom. They have to pay their own way. They have to raise the money from their own taxpayers, respond to their own voters, and come up with solutions to their own problems. Now, there's a little federal money that's handed out, contributes somewhat to state and local budgets, but it's not a substantial amount of money,
And it's not handed out in any particularly equitable fashion. It's not like it's given from the rich states or the rich parts of the country to the poor parts of the country. It's pretty much handed out evenly to everybody. And I found out why that was recently when Ted Kennedy came up for re-election. And you've heard of him. Ted said that the time before, he had said he could do more for Massachusetts. I don't know why he thought he could do more for Massachusetts, but the voters believed him, elected him to office. And then 6 years later, a study came out showing that previously, for every dollar Massachusetts had sent in, and I should tell you, Massachusetts is one of the wealthiest states in the United States on a per capita basis. It's not doing as well as it did during the Massachusetts Miracle, but it's always done pretty well. And so in any equitable system, it should be getting a lot less than it's paying into the federal government if we're going to help out the needy parts of the country. Well, Massachusetts was getting $1.03 back for every dollar it was putting in. But while Ted Kennedy was senator for 6 years, it was only getting 99 cents back. So 6 years later, it was only getting 99 cents back. And so his Republican opponent pointed this out to the voters and said, Kennedy promised that he would do more. In fact, Massachusetts has lost ground. We're only getting 99 cents back on the dollar. Well, I'm not picking on Senator Kennedy here. I'm just saying that that's what every senator, that's what every representative has to worry about. When they're up for re-election, they have to prove that they are getting as much back to their district as the taxpayers are sending in, or something close to it. Otherwise, they run into this kind of political difficulty. So as a result, when the money gets handed out by Congress, it gets handed out in a more or less even-handed way. Passed around the country. Now, that's not the way it's done in Europe. In Europe, it's a far more equitable system. The money is taken from the wealthier parts of the country and redistributed to the needier parts. You can see this most clearly in Germany today, where a tremendous amount of wealth is moving from the western part of Germany to the eastern part of Germany, but it's not exclusive to Germany. You find this in general throughout most European countries. The United States is really unusual. Also, you remember when Texas had a bad time of it. Did the federal government come in and bail out Texas? No, it might give a few dollars here or there that it could talk about, but on the whole, it was up to Texas to come out of the recession that it suffered during the collapse of the price of oil. So, on the whole, this is what state and local governments have to do. And as Peter Eisinger was saying, that's what cities have to do now. They have to pretty much put their buckets down and where they are and solve their own problems. Nobody's going to bail them out. And by and large, that's nothing new. That's the way American politics has been for a very long period of time. And I suggest to you that that is a very good thing. That it's the way things should be, and it's the way they have been for a very long time, and the devolution that's been occurring in the last few years has been nothing but moving in a direction that is consistent with what are what's good for the United States and the U.S. economy. Now this means that local governments are at risk of going bankrupt, and there are instances in New York City nearly went bankrupt, did get a little help from the federal government, but had to pay the price of somebody closely watching its budget for a stretch of time. Orange County thought they could play the derivatives market without impunity and found out you couldn't do that. So you pay the price in the United States if you don't manage your fiscal affairs properly, and that disciplines local political leaders, some of whom are here today. They have to worry about this problem all the time, and it focuses people's attentions on solving problems. And I think one of the consequences of this is that the United States has the finest industrial policy in the world. We talk about Japan Inc. or Germany Inc., the close cooperation between business and government for the purposes of economic development, and we say, well, we don't have that in the United States. Some people think that's a bad idea. Some people think it's a good idea that we don't have it in the United States. They're both wrong. We have a lot of cooperation between government and business in the United States. It just doesn't happen in Washington. It happens in state capitals, and it happens in our cities, it happens at the local level, and it happens in a context where every state, every local government has to be constantly worrying about what can it do to attract productive citizens and productive entrepreneurs to their community so that the tax revenues will come in so that their fiscal problems will be resolved. And that produces a situation where leaders in the public and the private sector work together to solve common problems in a situation where they are disciplined by a competitive marketplace. And if they make mistakes, they got to correct them quickly or they're going to pay the price. And that's how we, through our federal system, create an extremely dynamic cooperative relationship between the public and the private sector in order to maximize economic growth for the country as a whole. And I don't think that one of the reasons why the United States in the 1990s has come back from the doldrums of the late 1970s, 1980s is because of the dynamism of our governmental system, and we don't want to lose that. Now, having said all of that, now, which makes me look like a right-wing Republican, right? I mean, I'm sure you've all concluded that now. Having said all of that, there is one area of government responsibility which I think local and state governments are not as good at dealing with, and that has to do with redistributive policy. And I think it's not an accident that we've sorted out the responsibility of different kinds of governmental activities to different levels of government quite appropriately. 2/3 of all the traditional government services are paid for by state and local governments. By traditional government services, I mean police protection, fire protection, education, transportation facilities, sanitation facilities, parks, recreation areas. The vast panoply of services that are necessary for the sustaining of economic development and economic productivity in the United States. Now, 2/3 of the cost of these, which is about 15% of GNP, 2/3 of the cost is paid for by state and local governments. About 10% is paid for by state and local governments out of their own tax revenues, 5% by the national government, with the trend line being more and more that these kinds of things should be paid for by state and local governments, and I think it's a good thing that it is moving in that direction. Now, with respect to redistributive policy or social services, by which I mean Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, welfare, and a whole array of social services, the 2/3 of the cost of these services are borne by the national government, and only it's even a higher percentage of that. About 75% of the cost of these services are being borne by the federal government, and only a small portion being borne by state and local governments. Now, that I think is an appropriate division of responsibilities. I think that it is the responsibility of the national government to finance, not necessarily always administer, but at least to bear the main responsibility for financing our social service programs. Because what makes state and local governments so effective at fostering economic development makes them quite ineffective at providing high-quality social services. I have one way of dramatizing this point that to me makes it the most convincing, and that is the town near the one I live in is Framingham, Massachusetts. And Framingham happens to be a place where they have a high density of social services for poor people and homeless people and sick people and needy people. Some of which the town has created and some of which have been placed there by state agencies. But for one reason or another, there happens to be a substantial concentration of very good, well-administered, high-quality services that everybody says are doing their job the way they should be doing them. And the result is that Framingham's a pretty good place for poor people to live. And poor people are moving there. And the town is under pressure as a result, and candidates are running for office saying, why Framingham? Why is it that we have to bear this responsibility? Can't somebody else take some of the load? And that's exactly what the problem is for state and local governments. When they're asked to take on the responsibility for paying for the cost of the needy, the sick, and the poor, the incentives are to shift that problem elsewhere, to give that problem to somebody else. Because if you can get somebody else to bear the problem, then you can concentrate on those things that will be attractive to the productive element of your community. So that is why I say that if you devolve responsibility for welfare policy to the state and local levels, you will encourage a race to the bottom. That you will encourage a situation where every state, worrying that it will become a haven for the poor, a welfare magnet, will try to make sure that its neighbors don't have welfare policies more niggardly than theirs. Now, and I believe that this analysis essentially explains what happened in the last session of Congress. One of the things we don't realize is that there was a great deal of devolution that did occur in the developmental sector, that a lot of the traditional governmental services that were being paid for by the federal government were handed down to state and local governments. The federal government got out of a lot of things it had been involved in previously. And this was done. It was proposed by the Republicans, and it was agreed to by President Clinton. And Alice Rivlin was sitting there in the Office of Management and Budget saying, that's just exactly what I said in the book I wrote. And so she was very happy to hear the Republicans propose it. It came from the other side of the aisle, but she endorsed it quickly. She got the president's ear. It went through, and we were told again and again about all the conflicts in Washington, but in this particular case, there wasn't any conflict at all. There was an agreement on it, and there was agreement on it for a very good reason. It made sense. And so the problem was shifted to the lower levels. Now, where the Republicans got into trouble was to apply the devolution concept to social services as well, to redistributive policy, and they basically lost. Now, I know you said, well, but didn't welfare pass? Well, yes, welfare passed, but the main thing is what didn't happen. It's the dog that didn't bark that really should be looked at. And that is the largest social service program is not AFDC, but it's Medicaid. Medicaid in 1993 was costing $134 billion. Welfare was costing the federal government $22 billion. Food stamps was costing $24 billion, more than AFDC, and no cuts were made in that. No cuts were made in the school lunch program. No cuts were made in the Earned Income Tax Credit, and a whole host of other federal programs remain intact. Very little devolution of welfare responsibility was shifted to the local level. Well, how about welfare reform? It's my own feeling that the evidence shows that the states are going to race to the bottom, not immediately, not overnight. There are reasons why it's not going to happen overnight, which have to do with the very peculiar circumstances of how the legislation was written. States are being given money according to a formula based on how much they received in 1994. Well, since 1994, welfare rolls have gone down substantially. And there's different explanations for it. The Democrats say it's because the economy has improved. The great Clinton recovery is the explanation for the decline in the welfare rolls. The Republicans are saying, well, no, the reason for this is because we've got good, tough, strong governors who are managing the welfare rolls more efficiently, and we're taking a closer look at it. And other people are saying, no, finally Americans are saying being on welfare is a bad thing, and people need to take moral responsibility for their own lives, and that's finally having an impact on our society. So, and who knows? I think it's all of these things. I don't think there's any one single explanation for it, but for one reason or another, the welfare rolls have been falling substantially. And so one of the ironies of the devolution, that in terms of balancing the budget, we would be closer to a balanced budget today if the old entitlement program had remained in effect in welfare than if the new block grant had been put in its place, because the block grant is actually giving more money to the states than they would have received under the old entitlement formula because of the decline in the welfare roll. So this has freed up so that what's bad news for the federal deficit is good news for state and local governments, especially state governments, because they now have more money, and it's going to ease the transition to state-managed welfare. And who knows, maybe state officials will be creative in the use of this money, and it will be used in such a way as to address the underlying problems of welfare in a way that the old AFDC program could not. Actually, I have a colleague who says the AFDC program is gone for good. And even though he's a liberal and even though he was opposed to welfare reform, he says, you know, in retrospect, maybe they were right. And the reason he gives is nobody thought it was a good program. Everybody knew it was a terrible program. It was a program which forced poor people to choose between welfare and work. For every dollar you earned, you lost a dollar in benefits, probably, and then you had to pay taxes on the dollar you earned. So you came out negative on the whole process. It was very difficult to find anybody who could defend the old program seriously. And now maybe by devolving the responsibility to state officials, if there remains an underlying problem, the underlying problem is that people without adequate education cannot earn enough money in the marketplace today to raise children. It's just is the case. I mean, because we're competing with low-income wages around the world, it means that people who are going into the market, earning the minimum wage, they're not going to be able to enough to raise a family. So which suggests that probably you need some kind of an income supplement for those people who are in that situation, whether they're working or not working. And so the whole question probably should be to rephrase the problem of how can we provide family allowances to those families that are in need, but family allowances that don't force people not to work or don't encourage people not to form two-person families or two adult households or to have a marriage if you're going to have children. So maybe we need to redesign our program nationally so as to not to create the kinds of disincentives that existed under the old AFDC program, and maybe the new devolution will allow this to happen. Of course, maybe another thing we need to do is to do something about education in America, as if there's one thing that's clear is that Americans are committed to the goal of equality of opportunity. They may not believe in the equality of result, but they do believe in the equality of opportunity. And one of the things we need to do is to think about new ways of introducing more energy, more vitality into our educational system, especially in our central cities, because the kind of monopoly control we have over education in our central cities is the underlying a major underlying contributor to the problems of welfare that we have been talking about. And rather than trying to solve that problem through more welfare assistance, maybe we need to address the underlying problem of education in our central cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to ask the paper presenters just to step down and ask our discussants to come up. Please stay in you can stretch, but we want to get going because we're running a little late.